The lawyer's office smelled like polished wood and old money, the kind of place where decisions were made quietly and consequences lasted generations. My brother sat across from me with his ankle resting casually on his knee, swirling a glass of scotch like this was a celebration instead of a funeral. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. And I remember thinking, even before the will was read, that he already knew something I didn't. When the lawyer finally adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, the room seemed to shrink. My pulse started beating in my ears, not from anticipation, but from a strange sense of dread I couldn't explain yet. The first page went to Julian. Then the second. Each sentence landed like a small, controlled explosion, and with every one, Julian's smile grew sharper. I watched his fingers tighten slightly around the glass as numbers were read aloud. Big ones. Life-changing ones. And with every pause the lawyer took, I felt something heavy settling in my chest, like my body already knew what was coming next. When my turn finally came, the lawyer slid a single document across the desk toward me. It wasn't thick. It wasn't embossed. It looked old, yellowed, almost apologetic just sitting there. I picked it up slowly, already bracing myself. An abandoned mining claim, the lawyer said gently, like he was afraid the words might bruise me. Nevada desert. Julian laughed. Not nervously. Not in disbelief. He laughed like someone who had just won something they'd been owed for a long time. A sandbox, he said. Dad really had a sense of humor, didn't he? The lawyer didn't correct him. He just looked at me with a kind of pity that burned worse than Julian's grin. And that was the moment I understood something important. Whatever this was, it wasn't an accident. I folded the deed carefully and slipped it into my pocket, telling myself I could handle humiliation. I'd handled worse. 15 years of 60-hour weeks at my father's logistics company while Julian drifted through life on beaches and bad ideas. I was used to being the responsible one. What I wasn't used to was being discarded. And as I walked out of that office, Julian's laughter followed me down the hall, echoing in a way that made it feel permanent. I didn't know it yet, but that sound would come back to him later. When I got home, the front door was open. That should have been my first warning. The second was the silence. No music. No television. Just the hollow sound of my own footsteps as I stepped inside and saw cardboard boxes stacked against the walls. Half-empty shelves. Closet doors hanging open. My life, quietly dismantled. And in the middle of it all stood my wife, Cassandra, holding her phone like she was already halfway gone. She didn't look surprised to see me. She didn't even look guilty. "I'm leaving," she said, calm and rehearsed, like she'd practiced the sentence until it felt weightless. I asked her why, even though my eyes had already caught the packed suitcases near the door. She sighed, the way someone does when they think you're being intentionally slow. "I'm choosing someone with vision," she said. "Someone successful." Sterling. The name didn't need explanation. He'd been circling our social group for months, always just close enough to feel intentional. Expensive watch. Confident laugh. Future plans spoken like guarantees. Cassandra told me she couldn't waste her life waiting for potential. She gestured vaguely, not just at the boxes, but at me. At the deed she didn't even know about yet. Or maybe she already did. "I inherited dirt," I said quietly. She nodded, almost relieved that I understood. "Exactly," she replied. "I'm not betting my future on miracles." And just like that, she was gone. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click that echoed louder than any argument ever could. As her car pulled away, I stood there in the silence and realized something cold and sharp. She hadn't left because she loved someone else. She left because she believed success was already decided. And in her mind, it wasn't me. If you're listening right now, pause for a second. Where are you watching from? Because in that moment, standing alone in a half-empty house, I felt like I'd been erased. No job. No marriage. No inheritance that mattered. Just a worthless piece of paper in my pocket and the growing certainty that everyone I trusted had already written my ending for me. And that realization did something dangerous. It stripped away fear. Because when you have nothing left to protect, you stop playing safe. I drove for hours that night with no destination, replaying every moment over and over. Julian's laugh. Cassandra's certainty. The lawyer's pity. The deed sat on the passenger seat, catching the streetlights as if trying to get my attention. By morning, I knew exactly what I had to do. Not because I believed there was anything valuable in that desert, but because I needed proof. Proof that it was worthless. Proof that this chapter really was over. I wasn't chasing hope. I was chasing closure. 2 days later, I was on the road to Nevada. The desert stretched endlessly in front of me, heat shimmering off the asphalt like a mirage, and with every mile, the world I'd lost felt farther away. I told myself this was just paperwork. A formality. A way to cleanly sever the last tie to a life that had already moved on without me. I hired a local geologist named Beckett to evaluate the claim, someone cynical enough not to sugarcoat reality. I wanted the truth, even if it hurt. When we finally reached the site, the road simply ended. We had to hike the rest of the way, the sun pressing down hard enough to make each step feel deliberate. I sat on a rock near a dried-up creek bed, the forfeiture papers in my bag, ready to sign them and walk away forever. Beckett wandered off with his equipment, silent, methodical, unimpressed. I watched him crouch near strange white crystalline deposits that looked like nothing more than salt, already preparing myself for disappointment. He stopped suddenly. He didn't call out. He didn't move. His body went completely still, like something had just clicked into place. I opened my mouth to ask if we were done, but before I could speak, he dropped his clipboard. The metal clatter echoed through the canyon, sharp and final, and he whispered something under his breath that made my stomach tighten. And in that moment, watching his hands begin to shake as he stared at the ground, I realized that whatever he was seeing down there was about to change everything. But I had no idea how. I didn't say a word at first. I just watched Beckett kneel there in the dirt, his fingers brushing the ground like he was afraid it might disappear if he blinked. The desert was silent except for the sound of my own breathing, suddenly loud and uneven. Whatever he was seeing, he hadn't expected it. And that scared me more than disappointment ever could. He finally looked up at me, eyes wide, pupils blown, like someone who had just seen a ghost. "This isn't what you think it is," he said slowly. That sentence alone sent a chill through me, because I had already assumed the worst. I thought he was about to confirm everything Julian and Cassandra believed. That this land was a joke. That I'd wasted my last dollars coming out here. I nodded, bracing myself. "Just tell me," I said. "I need it documented." He swallowed hard. Then he looked back down at the creek bed, scooped a small sample into his tester, and waited. The seconds stretched. His jaw tightened. His hand started trembling again. "This isn't gold," he whispered. For half a heartbeat, I felt relief. Gold would have been almost cruel in its irony. But then he continued, his voice barely steady. "It's lithium. High grade. Primary vein. And it's not small." I didn't understand yet. Not really. I knew the word, of course. Everyone did. But I didn't grasp the weight of what he was saying until I saw the way he stared at the land, like it had just spoken to him. "How bad is it?" I asked, still thinking in terms of loss. He laughed once, short and disbelieving. "Bad," he repeated. "Silas, this could power half the country." The air felt different after that. Thicker. Charged. I sat back on the rock, my legs suddenly weak, staring at the dirt I'd been ready to abandon minutes earlier. In that instant, everything Cassandra had measured me by, money, status, future, collapsed into a single mistake she would never be able to undo. But even then, I didn't celebrate. Because opportunity doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives quietly. And it demands discipline. I tore the forfeiture papers into strips and let the wind scatter them into the canyon. Beckett watched me carefully, like he was gauging what kind of man I was about to become. "You need to be careful," he said. "If word gets out too soon," I cut him off. "It won't," I replied. And I meant it. Because I already knew this wasn't something you rushed. This was something you protected. Before I tell you what I did next, let me ask you something. If you discovered something like this, something that could change your entire life, would you tell anyone? Or would you disappear first? Because that choice matters more than people realize. I disappeared. For 6 months, I lived in a cheap roadside motel under a name that wasn't mine. The carpet smelled like old cigarettes and regret, and the air conditioner rattled all night, but it was perfect. No one looking for me would ever think to look there. I spent my days on burner phones and my nights reading contracts until my eyes burned. I partnered with a green energy conglomerate through a shell company, my name nowhere on the paperwork. Mineral rights were secured quietly. Permits filed methodically. Every move calculated. Every signature deliberate. Back home, the world kept spinning without me. Julian burned through his trust fund faster than I thought possible. Bad investments. Worse advice. I heard through old contacts that he'd started selling off assets, convinced money would always come back the way it always had. Cassandra married Sterling in a ceremony that looked expensive even through photos. They smiled like people who believed the future owed them something. And the more confident they became, the more patient I grew. But patience doesn't mean inactivity. While they were celebrating, I was building. While Julian laughed, I learned. While Sterling made calls to expand his influence, I documented every corner he cut. And somewhere along the way, I realized my father hadn't given me a joke. He'd given me a test. He gave Julian money he could waste. He gave me something that required work. And that difference was about to matter. The first sign that my silence was working came in the form of a text message from Julian. "You still playing minor?" he wrote. I'll buy the dirt off you. 10 grand. Charity. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying with a single word. No, he sent laughing emojis. He had no idea what he was standing on. Then Sterling made his move. He used his connections to push for a regional stop work order on new mining permits, citing environmental concerns. It was clean, legal, strategic. And when I saw the notice come across my desk, my stomach dropped. He didn't know it was my claim, but he was circling it. If the order stuck, everything I'd built in silence would stall. I reached for my phone to make a call that would change the entire direction of this story. But before I tell you who I called, you need to understand what Sterling didn't know. Because while he was using influence, I had been collecting leverage. And the moment he tried to block my future, he stepped directly into a trap he couldn't see yet. Across town, preparations were already underway for the annual Family Foundation Gala. And I decided that would be the night everything came into the open. The gala had always been my father's favorite night of the year. A room full of powerful people pretending generosity while quietly measuring one another's worth. I hadn't attended since the will reading. No one expected me to. That was exactly why it mattered. In the days leading up to it, I stayed quiet on purpose. Sterling's stop work order was still active, the permits frozen in bureaucratic limbo. Julian was bleeding money faster now, selling off non-essential assets and telling anyone who would listen that he was restructuring. Cassandra appeared everywhere beside Sterling, smiling a little too tightly, her confidence beginning to look rehearsed. They thought momentum was on their side. That belief made them careless. I made my first call 3 nights before the gala. Not to a lawyer. Not to a politician. To someone far less visible. Someone who understood patterns. I told him exactly what Sterling had done, how the interference lined up with pending audits, how certain filings appeared just a little too convenient. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Send me everything." I did. But that wasn't the move that mattered most. That came later. If you're listening right now, ask yourself something honestly. When someone thinks they're untouchable, do you confront them head on? Or do you let them walk into the room where everyone can see them fall? The night of the gala arrived cold and clear. I stood outside the venue for a long moment before going in, adjusting the cuff of a suit Julian would have recognized immediately. It cost more than his remaining liquid assets. I smiled at the thought, but not for long. Because once I walked through those doors, there was no going back. The room went quiet in stages. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. Someone dropped a glass. I felt eyes on me from every direction, curiosity cutting through the champagne haze. Julian was standing near the bar, mid-laugh, when he saw me. The sound died in his throat. Cassandra froze beside him, her hand tightening around Sterling's arm without realizing it. Her eyes moved over me quickly. Not with nostalgia. With calculation. She was looking for reassurance that she hadn't been wrong. That whatever success I was wearing was temporary. When she didn't find it, something flickered across her face. Fear. And she masked it just as quickly. Julian recovered first. He always did. "Look who survived the desert," he said loudly, drawing attention back to himself. A few nervous laughs followed. I didn't respond. I just waited until the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then I spoke. "I hear you're selling the estate," I said casually. "The offer you got this morning from the lithium syndicate?" I paused, just long enough. That was me. For a second, no one reacted. Then Julian's glass shattered in his hand. The sound was sharp. Final. People turned. Cassandra's breath caught audibly. Sterling took half a step back without realizing it. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I explained calmly. How I'd acquired his outstanding debt. How I now owned the house he lived in. How everything had been done legally, transparently, and months ago. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. Julian tried to speak, but no sound came out. The laughter he'd carried for years had nowhere to go now. That was when Cassandra stepped forward. "I didn't know," she said quickly, her voice softer, almost hopeful. "You should have told me." The words hung between us, waiting to be accepted. I looked at her for a long moment, long enough for her to think it might work. Then I turned away. Because the truth was simple. She hadn't left because she didn't know. She left because she didn't wait. Before Julian could recover, the room shifted again. 2 men in dark suits entered quietly through the side door. They weren't guests. They weren't security. Sterling noticed them a second before they reached him. His face drained of color. One of them spoke low and firm. "Mr. Hale, we need to ask you a few questions." The word, question, didn't mean what he wanted it to mean. Cassandra's hand slipped from his arm as if burned. The gala didn't end with shouting. It ended with whispers. Phones raised discreetly. eyes following Sterling as he was escorted out for questioning related to market manipulation and fraud. Julian stood frozen, surrounded by people who suddenly remembered other conversations they needed to have. I leaned in close enough for him to hear me. "You have 30 days, I said. "After that, I'm turning the estate into a regional headquarters." He nodded without looking at me. He finally understood the game he'd been playing. And that he'd lost it long before tonight. As I walked out into the cool night air, my phone buzzed in my pocket. One message. From a number I hadn't seen in months. "Cassandra. I made a mistake," it read. "We need to talk." I stared at the screen, knowing exactly what that conversation would be about. And I realized something important then. This story wasn't over yet. Because the hardest part wasn't winning. It was deciding what I was going to do next. And that choice would change everything. I didn't answer Cassandra's message right away. I stood there on the steps of the venue, the night air cool against my face, rereading the words until they lost their weight. I made a mistake. People say that when the cost finally becomes visible. Not when the choice is made. I slipped my phone back into my pocket without replying and drove away before doubt had time to catch up. The fallout didn't explode the way people expect these things to. There were no headlines screaming my name. No dramatic arrests splashed across the news. Just quiet consequences unfolding one by one. Sterling's firm didn't issue statements. They canceled meetings. Then they canceled mergers. Then they canceled him. The investigation moved the way investigations always do, slow on the surface, relentless underneath. Every document I'd saved, every pattern I'd flagged, every delay he'd forced through influence instead of merit came back to him in ways he couldn't talk his way out of. Julian called me 3 days later. I let it ring. He called again. And again. When I finally answered, he sounded smaller than I remembered. Not angry. Not mocking. Just tired. He told me he didn't understand how this had happened. How the money had disappeared so fast. How I'd managed to get ahead without him noticing. I listened without interrupting. Then I told him the truth he'd never wanted to hear. "You were given everything," I said. "I was given time." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. He finally understood the difference. A week later, Cassandra showed up at my door. She looked exactly like she always had, polished, composed, confident, but something underneath was fractured now. She talked fast, like if she didn't keep moving, the moment would catch her. She told me Sterling had lied to her. That she hadn't known how bad things were. That she believed in a future that turned out to be smoke. I let her talk. People reveal more when you don't stop them. When she finally paused, she looked at me like she was waiting for absolution. "If I had stayed," she said carefully, "would this still have happened?" That question mattered. Because it wasn't really about me. It was about whether her choice had been wrong, or just poorly timed. I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied. "It wouldn't have. Because I wouldn't have become this version of myself." The truth landed between us, heavy and unavoidable. She hadn't just left me. She disqualified herself from the future that followed. She left quietly. No argument. No drama. Just the soft click of the door closing again. And for the first time since everything began, the silence felt earned. The desert changed next. Heavy machinery arrived at the claim under a sky so wide it made everything else feel small. Roads were cut where there had been nothing but dust. Teams moved with purpose. Plans turned into structures. Every time I stood on that land, I thought about the moment Beckett dropped his clipboard. The moment the future shifted without asking permission. I called him eventually. Thanked him. He laughed and told me he still couldn't believe it. Neither could I. If you're listening to this right now, ask yourself something. How many times have you been handed something that looked worthless, only to walk away because someone else told you it was? Because the real tragedy isn't losing what you never had. It's abandoning what you didn't recognize yet. Julian moved out of the estate on the 30th day. No fight. No delay. Just boxes and silence. He took a mid-level position in the industry he once thought he owned. I heard he worked hard. I heard he kept his head down. For the first time in his life, no one was waiting to save him. I didn't interfere. Some lessons only stick when they're lived. Months later, I returned to the creek bed alone. The place where everything began. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the land. I stood there thinking about my father. About how he'd watched both his children grow up and made a decision no one understood at the time. He hadn't left me dirt. He'd left me a chance. And he'd known exactly who would recognize it. The geologist didn't just change my fortune. He exposed how cheaply the people closest to me had valued my future. And once I saw that clearly, I never let anyone else decide it for me again. The desert is unforgiving. It doesn't reward entitlement. It doesn't care about appearances. It reveals what's real, and strips away everything else. And in the end, that's what made it honest. If you made it this far, comment patience if you believe the long game always wins. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't striking back. It's waiting until the ground tells the truth.